In October of 2024, self-described anti-fascist organisation Hope Not Hate, who are notorious for doxing, harassing, and smearing anon accounts, members of the public, MPs, political pundits, and yours truly as Nazis, fascists, racists, anti-Semites, Islamophobes, pick a slur, they put out a documentary called Undercover, exposing the far right, with the assistance of Channel 4 and then a series of follow-up articles in The Guardian. This starred, and were written by, Harry Shukman. And the release of that documentary is overshadowed by reporting by yours truly on my former Lotus Eaters show, but also on Substack, about the fact that Harry Shukman used a fake passport to entrap the subjects of that documentary. This raised many questions, and I listed them here. How did he procure this convincing fake of a government document? During the documentary, he travelled to Poland, Greece, and Croatia. Did he use that passport to do so? Did Hope Not Hate exchange money with a third party to produce this document? And if they did, would it constitute a crime under the Identity Documents Act of 2010? Did Hope Not Hate have undisclosed assistance from a government department or intelligence agency in gaining this fake passport to deceive members of the public? To date, none of the subjects of Hope Not Hate's undercover investigation have been charged with a crime. I don't think they were suspects of criminal activity at the time, they just held opinions that Hope Not Hate didn't like. So if there was state involvement, what was the justification for doing so? I reported it to both the Met Police and Action Fraud, and every time that I rang for an update, despite having a crime reference number, they couldn't find the case. It had mysteriously disappeared, and I had to keep refiling. To date, I've received no update. But we do have an update thanks to the investigative work of John Power over at The Spectator. Despite my disagreements with the editors over at OQS and The Spectator, this has to be praised. So we finally have an answer as to how Harry Shukman procured this fake passport. It doesn't seem to be through illegal means, but it certainly is through duplicitous and immoral means. And so this fits the pattern of Hope Not Hate at least skirting the line of legality throughout their career of activism. Their members have faced the protections of a two-tier justice system. They have been afforded access to parliament, privileges by members of the sitting government, and even funding from the Home Office and Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities under the previous Conservative government. Hope Not Hate is being protected by state power despite their immoral and, in some cases, potentially illegal activities. And so I hope to present not just answers to how this passport was procured today, but the definitive case for why Hope Not Hate should be considered by my friends in the US who are watching from Washington as part of the global Antifa terror network, and therefore prescribed. Because Hope Not Hate have been found by, among other things, a Swedish government report to have fed information to Antifa cells in Europe, in Germany, and this information did result in violence back in 2018. Hope Not Hate knowingly put people's names out there and put a target on their back with the various allegations of wrongthink that they attach to those names, and this has resulted in people being targeted for violence. They know what they're doing, they keep doing it, they use bullying, harassment, and lawfare tactics to try to insulate themselves from criticism, and the UK government won't do anything about it because they have friends in high places. So we need our allies overseas to recognise this leftist mafioso organisation for what it is, and take action to protect members of the British public who are just exercising their lawful right to speak freely and engage in democratic politics. If you need examples for how Hope Not Hate have benefited from a two-tier justice system, look no further than the aftermath of the Southport riots, when Nick Lowles, the CEO and founder of Hope Not Hate, spread a self-professed hoax about hundreds of far-right rallies materialising on one single day that then led to counter-demonstrators from the Socialist Workers' Party and Stand Up to Racism, which are funded through taxpayer money by major unions like the Transport and Education Union. They then showed up to face this phantom far-right and were then photographed and plastered across the front pages of newspapers the following day, presented as an organic grassroots effort to repudiate the far-right. This came at the same time that Keir Starmer was talking constantly about far-right racists and mobilising the magistrates' courts around the clock to expedite the prosecution of people who had said offensive things online or to police officers. Think of Lucy Connolly, the mother jailed for 31 months, or Peter Lynch, the grandfather who is imprisoned for shouting at police officers, who was then imprisoned and died while in prison. his family never get to see him again. But Nick Lowles, who knowingly spread false information online, saying the list was a hoax, then justifying it by saying, but just look at the front pages of today's papers, an anti-racist message is being transmitted to millions of homes this morning. He wasn't reprimanded by the police. He wasn't interviewed. He wasn't charged. He wasn't prosecuted. He also wasn't prosecuted for the following: spreading false information about reports coming in of an acid attack against Muslim women out of a car window in Middlesbrough. Absolutely horrendous. This was then corrected with a community note because Cleveland police had to put out a statement saying no such attack has taken place or been reported. It was then amplified by Josh Fenton Glynn MP saying far-right cowards attacking women. When people show you who you are, believe them. So he's deceiving members of parliament. It's being amplified by members of the government who are currently condemning misinformation that could lead to real-world violence. And we know that it did lead to some Muslim men coming out on the streets because one particular protester in a video, in a street interview, said, "We are Pakistani Muslims. We were born here. Our Muslim sisters are getting acid attacked," which was the reason why he showed up. So he believed this false piece of information circulated by Nick Lowles. Now, this man didn't necessarily engage in violence, but at the same time, there were Muslim militias in Birmingham, masked, carrying weapons, who did engage in violence. They intimidated a Sky News journalist, they slashed tyres on her van, and they lacerated the liver of a bystander at a pub. So Nick Lowles spread false information, which, under the Online Safety Act, which he supported, should be an offence if the person sends a message and the message conveys information that the person knows to be false, which Nick Lowles has done on multiple occasions now, and at the time of sending it, the person intended the message or the information in it to cause non-trivial psychological or physical harm to a likely audience, and the person has no reasonable excuse for sending the message. Well, as a result of Nick Lowles spreading that hoax, the Socialist Worker Party did gather as counter-protests, and Ricky Jones, the former Dartford Labour councillor, said we should slit the throats of disgusting Nazi fascists, to the applause of an entire crowd who were presumably eager to act upon his call to violence. Ricky Jones conspicuously also received no punishment for this. He was cleared of all charges. But Nick Lowles hasn't been prosecuted or interviewed by the Met Police. He's apologised and admitted wrongdoing, but that didn't stop Lucy Connolly from being prosecuted, so people are noticing a conspicuous double standard here. And people were also suspicious of an intelligence connection or protection by the state because of Harry Shukman's personal and family history being linked to MI6. Harry Shukman studied at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge for his undergraduate and got an MA in Terrorism, Security and Society from King's College London. His father, David Shukman, was employed at the BBC for 38 years, and in 2002, while their diplomatic correspondent, he authored an inaccurate article that wrongly alleged a shareholder in a Congolese diamond mine owned by Oryx Natural Resources was the same person as an Al-Qaeda associate jailed for his involvement in the 1998 bombing of US embassies in Africa. Oryx had then sued the BBC, and the case was settled for a sum of over £500,000. In a subsequent Guardian report, we learned the false information was fed to David by a source who got it from MI6. So his father was only one step removed from MI6. As the report says here, a theory is that Johnson Thomas's MI6 sources were at least not questioned by Shukman's contacts in the Foreign Office. An interview with Foreign Office Minister Peter Hain was included in the report, in which he explained the government's concerns that profits from conflict diamonds were being channeled to Al-Qaeda. While he did not mention Oryx, ministers were keen to underscore the global threat of terror to justify military action in Afghanistan. And Harry Shukman's father himself was only one step removed from MI6 because his father, Harry Shukman's grandfather, was a British spy. According to a book, One Blade of Grass, written by Harry Shukman's uncle, David's brother, Henry Shukman, he says, "My father was a historian in Russian studies at Oxford University and was offered a fellowship in Helsinki and took his family with him. From Helsinki, Russia was less than a day away by boat across the Gulf of Finland. It was the Cold War, and when a message came through from Cambridge Circus that my father was to travel to Leningrad on urgent business, he didn't hesitate. Although he was a quiet man, like many Russianists at the time, he also did occasional work for the circus, namely MI6. He was a part-time spy. Mum and Dad went together, they disappeared across the water into the Soviet wastes, leaving the kids in the care of the Finnish au pair." According to his Wikipedia page, Harold Shukman, who obviously Harry may have been named after, was born in London to Jewish immigrants who fled Tsarist Russia, fearing persecution. He then developed a lifelong fixation with communism, focusing his PhD thesis at Oxford on the Polish Socialist Party, the Jewish Labour Bund, and publishing and translating numerous books on Soviet communism. This connection to communism is relevant for Hope Not Hate, because Hope Not Hate has had long-standing connections with communist activists and still to this day employs a communist, Matthew Collins. And by Hope Not Hate's own standard, if one member of an organisation was outed as a Nazi, they would call it a Nazi organisation. Therefore, Hope Not Hate is a communist organisation being directly funded by the government with friends in the sitting Labour Party and Labour government, and who may have individuals who have connections to intelligence, which we will continue to explore later. So, all of these considerations were relevant when wondering how Harry Shukman came to own the fake passport of Christopher Charles Morton. When I reported the fake passport, I redacted some of the information just in case that it corresponded with information on someone else's real passport. Other people who had accessed the unredacted version were trying to check whether or not it was authentic, or whether or not the location that it was issued was an indication that it had been issued by an intelligence agency or a government department that was working with Hope Not Hate in their undercover investigations. And The Spectator did an investigation into the passport, which has now been deleted. It was posted in September, it has been archived here, and it's been deleted because they have issued an apology to Harry Shukman and Hope Not Hate, because we now know how they came by the passport. But we will go through the original article first, because I think the speculation was all warranted, and it was a great piece of work by John Power, which, if anything, has just been built upon in the apology. So John Power came by the unredacted version of the passport via Simone Collins, the wife of Malcolm Collins, one of the subjects of the undercover sting operations related to the documentary that weren't featured in the documentary but were included in a series of follow-up articles in The Guardian, smearing people who are interested in embryonic testing as eugenicists. It's not a practice that I stand by as a Catholic, but it isn't illegal. It's just a violation of the blank slate morality that Hope Not Hate pushes as radical liberals or communists. And Power writes that Shukman's undercover work became a Guardian long read and a Channel 4 documentary, and his book, Year of the Rat, was published by Penguin in May. Shukman describes a year spent infiltrating the far right using false identities. What neither the book, Channel 4, nor the Guardian article mentioned was the existence of the Christopher Morton passport. That omission matters, because the use of such a document is not merely a journalistic parlor trick, but may constitute a crime. Under the Identity Documents Act 2010, it is an offence to possess a false passport with improper intention, such as using it to establish an identity to another person. The maximum penalty is 10 years. Even without intention, possession without a reasonable excuse carries a sentence of 2 years in jail. The Forgery and Counterfeiting Act 1981 makes it a further offence to use a false instrument intending it to be accepted as genuine to another's prejudice. Neither law contains a defence of journalism in the public interest, so he couldn't have said that I owned this document for a journalistic purpose. That wouldn't stop it from being a crime if it was a forgery. Power continues. If the Morton passport was fabricated and used in Britain, it places its holder on the wrong side of criminal statute. Or, if it was used to travel abroad, it may have incurred further offences. The newspaper industry's own code set out when deception can be justified. Clause 10 of the ipso editor's code prohibits misrepresentation unless it is justified in the public interest, and the material cannot be obtained by other means. The Ofcom code says much the same for broadcasters, so this implicates both Channel 4 and The Guardian. Undercover work has always carried risk. Think of the classic exposés of abusive care homes or corrupt MPs. But those cases generally involved concealed cameras or pseudonyms, not sovereign identity documents. Falsifying a passport is qualitatively different. It is not simply a question of taste or editorial judgment, but of criminal liability. And so this raises awkward questions for those who publish Shukman's work. The Guardian ran its long article by him on 24th of April, despite being sent evidence that Shukman had used a fake passport in his investigation. A Guardian spokesperson said, "We are satisfied that our editorial processes were followed. Neither Penguin nor Channel 4 responded to the Spectator's approach for comment. Shukman's work was supported through Hope Not Hate. When approached for comment, they stated they stand by the accuracy of Shukman's investigation and described the allegation that he used fake passport as highly libelous. Well, it was fake because it's not his actual name, and so the means by which he procured the passport are legitimate grounds of speculation, especially if, when approached for comment, Hope Not Hate didn't clarify how this happened. So the Spectator were correct to publish this article. It's a shame that they've now retracted it, basically under duress. Shukman was asked whether he had obtained or used any passport not issued to him, who created it, and whether his editors were aware. He didn't respond to the Spectator's approach for comment either. It's possible, Power writes, that the photograph that he had seen is a doctored image of a real passport, meaning Shukman didn't physically create a fake passport. But even with this provision, it's still illegal under the 2010 Identity Act to provide a document which purports to be a United Kingdom passport, which would include a doctored image. Another important question surrounds the police response or lack thereof, and this is the part that I was quoted in this article before I became persona non grata at The Spectator because of my censored debate with Michael Gove, the footage of which has still not been released. In October last year, Power writes, the broadcaster Connor Tomlinson reported Shukman's fake passport to the Metropolitan Police. They have still failed to respond to his report, and I provided John with all of the evidence and crime reference numbers of that report. When a Freedom of Information request was made to the Home Office regarding Shukman's actions, they refused on the grounds of Section 31 of the Freedom of Information Act, which relates specifically to law enforcement. The Met had not responded to our approach for comment by the time of going to press. Even if the Met Police and the Home Office were not involved in this particular investigation, and there are still questions as to whether or not they were, it has been for some time the case that the Met Police, the Home Office, the intelligence services have farmed out their undercover investigations to NGOs like Hope Not Hate. I had this confirmed by a university professor who specialises in such matters, who said that his contacts in the police have said that the likes of Hope Not Hate have been working for them for some time. So the fact that we now know how he came by this passport, and it doesn't seem to have been issued by an intelligence agency or the police, does not preclude the government, the intelligence agencies, or the police from being involved in Hope Not Hate investigations. There are reason to believe that there is some correspondence there. Questions about Shukman's methods extend beyond the passport. His reporting for Hope Not Hate included a series of highly questionable claims about researcher Jonathan Anomaly, who I have spoken to before, who has given me his book, who I have interviewed. Nice chap. He runs a business genetically screening embryos. Again, something I disagree with. Shukman said that Anomaly's work had been promoted by UN's Review, an online publication edited by what Power describes as a Holocaust denier, at first without noting that it had been in fact republished without his permission. He stated that Anomaly had co-hosted live events for Aporia, which he describes as a scientific racism website, and Anomaly says this is false, and it should be additionally offensive to Anomaly because he is Jewish. So I don't think he's in favour of the Holocaust, Harry. As Power says, both of these examples taken individually might be dismissed as carelessness. Taken together, they suggest a pattern of reporting that bolstered Shukman's narrative at the expense of accuracy. Again, even if it isn't illegal, it's certainly immoral and duplicitous. Power then notes some of Hope Not Hate's high-powered connections, including Morgan McSweeney, who is Keir Starmer's personal Mandarin, the Downing Street Chief of Staff, who Nick Lowles, the CEO of Hope Not Hate, campaigned alongside in 2010. After last year's election, Lowles was invited to Number 10 to brief staffers on opinion evidence underpinning the rise of the far right. Hence, I suppose, Keir Starmer's monomaniacal obsession with the far right. This was not the visit of an independent polling expert sharing scientific findings, Power writes, but another demonstration of Hope Not Hate's intimate involvement with Labour. There is, however, no suggestion that McSweeney or anyone else in the party could have known about Shukman's journalistic tactics in this specific incident. But, Power notes, key Labour figures in the Commons are Hope Not Hate fellow travellers. Records from the registers of interest show that the Director of Communications for Hope Not Hate works for Margaret Mullane, who became a Labour MP for Barking and Dagenham last year. Barking and Dagenham is significant because this is the seat, the council specifically, that in the 2000s Hope Not Hate were proudest about having fended off the BNP takeover of. Gurinder Josan MP, Anna Turley MP, and Sarah Owen MP have all held various positions within Hope Not Hate. Antonia Bantz, a 2024 Intake MP, is listed as Director of Hope Not Hate and received funding of $7,500 from Labour Together in 2024, the think tank created to help moderates reclaim the party in the Corbyn years. Hope Not Hate continually puts out hit pieces on Reform UK and Conservative ministers, even while receiving funding from the then Conservative government. So They are clearly a party political organ of the Labour Party in recipient of taxpayer funds and of charitable status, and yet, just like they're skirting the line of the law, they have evaded any consequences for this clear blurring of the lines between charity and political action. This article has since been retracted, and this week an apology to Hope Not Hate and Harry Shukman has been published. But the apology also contains an elaboration on criticisms of Hope Not Hate. It contains the real reason that Harry Shukman came to procure the passport, which I'm sure you've all been waiting for, but also the reason that the previous article that I was reading from has been pulled down. As Power writes in here, only after we published the article did the full truth emerge. In a legal letter to the Spectator, intimating claims for defamation, Hope Not Hate's legal team stated that Shukman had in fact changed his name by deed poll to Christopher Morton in order to obtain an official passport from the UK Passport Office, before changing it back to Harry Shukman by way of a second deed poll a year later. This means Shukman and Hope Not Hate did not, as we reported, create a fake passport or even edit a digital image of a real passport. For that error, we apologise fully and unreservedly. We take accuracy seriously, and we regret that this point was not established before publication. Our readers expect and deserve precision from us. In this instance, we fell short of the standards we set for ourselves. I understand that the Spectator is trying to evade legal action here, but I don't think this self-flagellation is warranted, because Hope Not Hate at any time, and Harry Shukman at any time, could have provided this information because they were asked by the Spectator. Harry Shukman didn't respond to comment, and Hope Not Hate did respond but didn't contain this detail. And Hope Not Hate are yet again using lawfare and intimidation tactics to silence their critics. This actually happened in the inverse to Douglas Murray back in 2024 when he revealed the sinister tactics of Hope Not Hate in Again the Spectator. He writes that some years ago, Hope Not Hate published a list of Islamophobes. One, a scholar that Douglas is friends with, subsequently had an Islamist come to his front door and try and shoot him in the head. He wrote about this at the time. The purpose of Hope Not Hate is to put a target on people's backs, is to outsource direct action to Antifa cells, to protesters, to, indirectly in this case, violent jihadists who were threatening this man with death, by naming and shaming targets that transgress against progressive morality, or Islam, or any other laundry list of woke grievances. Douglas then says, a while later, Hope Not Hate wrote a similar report and threatened to put Douglas in it, after knowing that their reporting puts people at risk. When Douglas lawyered up, Hope Not Hate explained that if he removed the piece criticising it, they might consider removing his name from its latest hit list. This is a quid pro quo. This is saying, we know what we're doing, we know what destroying your reputation can do to you, and so, if you don't criticise us, we won't attack you. We won't put a target on your back. So, the same thing is happening with the Spectator here. They didn't disclose the information ahead of time when prompted. They're now threatening the Spectator with libel litigation for speculating, I think perfectly legitimately, as to how Harry Shukman came by this fake passport, or at least presented the image of the fake passport to the subjects of the documentary and hit pieces. And it is fair to call it fake because Harry Shukman is his name. Harry Shukman was not going fully by the alias Christopher Charles Morton in everyday life because, as the article then goes on to disclose, during the period in which Shukman was supposedly acting solely under his new name, he published 3 separate articles bylined under his original name for the Gentleman's Journal. The headlines included, "Where are the super rich jetting off to this summer?" and "Cheers to Wilderness, Britain's poshest festival." His lawyers describe this simply as an oversight. Well, it could be an oversight, or it could be fair speculation that then the passport was only procured for the purposes of operating as an alias during the undercover investigation, while in his everyday life he was still known as Harry. He was still publishing under the name Harry. And so it seems like litigation has been used as a bullying and intimidation tactic against John Power and the Spectator here to prevent them from fairly speculating about the legality of how Harry Shukman came by the passport. So I don't think that we should be allowing, Hope Not Hate, the beneficiaries of government support and taxpayer funding, to bully and intimidate journalists in this way. In truth, the Spectator writes, We considered that Shukman did not intend to adopt a new identity or abandon his old identity fully and formally at all. It seems apparent to us, not least from the use of a second deed poll to change his name back to Harry Shukman, that he used Christopher Morton as a pseudonym, which he then leveraged to obtain a genuine passport from UK Passport Office. Whatever the technicalities of the process, the essential question is an ethical one, whether journalists, even in pursuit of stories they consider important, should be acquiring state-backed identification under a fabricated persona, even if done entirely lawfully, in order to deceive their targets. This is a perfectly legitimate question, and saying that it is libelous to suggest that he created a fake passport is therefore absurd. And so it's a shame the Spectator felt the need to apologise for this, but I'm glad that John Power has elaborated on the apology to say we still consider this to be unjust, duplicitous, and immoral. Shukman's lawyers are engaging in what Morgoth calls squid inking, sort of throwing up something as a cloud to obscure what they've actually done, because they claim here that in the first deed poll he fully and formally adopted the name Christopher Morton for all purposes, but it clearly wasn't for all purposes if he was still publishing under Harry Shukman and known to his friends as Harry Shukman, and only using the Christopher Charles Morton alias to present himself as an alias to the subjects of the documentary and hit pieces. So I don't think this would stand up, but again, it's clear that Hope Not Hate feel sufficiently arrogant to bully and intimidate their critics with threats of lawfare, with reputation destruction, because they have the backing of the British state, whether from Parliament, whether from funding from the Home Office, or whether from connections to the police and the intelligence services. As Power notes, the practice itself raises concerns about the ability of the UK Passport Office to prevent the use and abuse of the deed poll procedure to allow individuals to get British passports under pseudonyms. Given how easy it is to change one's name through a deed poll, it's concerning that obtaining a British passport in a new name is so simple and apparently lawful, and this means that other people, who don't do what Shukman did, could also do the same for different reasons. And it also means that taxpayer money was wasted on Harry Shukman's name being changed back and forth and a new passport being issued. So, even indirectly, taxpayers' money was spent so that Harry Shukman could pose as his alias to entrap the subjects of the documentary who hadn't done anything criminal, just held opinions that he didn't like. The Hope Not Hate charitable trust, which donates most of its money directly to Hope Not Hate Limited, is now subject to a compliance case by the Charity Commission brought forward by Jack Rankin MP, one of the few good Conservatives left on the Green benches, to, quote, assess concerns about its governance, including about the charity's activities and its relationship with the non-charitable entity. It's clearly a partisan party political entity attacking political opponents and members of the public on behalf of the Labour Party and communist ideologues. And Power notes that the Hope Not Hate Charitable Trust has recently changed its name to Hope Unlimited, seeming to try and avoid the public scrutiny about its connection to Hope Not Hate, the communist attack dog entity. It has in the past received tens of thousands of pounds in government grants from the Home Office's Counter-Extremism Unit, the entity that was headed up by Dame Sarah Khan, the sister of the former deputy head of Raiku, the Don't Look Back in Anger department, which uses controlled spontaneity events to manage and manipulate public perception in the aftermath of terror attacks to stop them blaming immigrants and Islam. So the tendrils to intelligence services, the Home Office, and the Deep State, as it is colloquially known, run deep and emanate from Hope Not Hate. This was all done, by the way, under a Conservative government, and Dame Sarah Khan's head will be reared again later in this report in relation to the sitting Labour government and her influence there, and her ability to launder the ideas of Hope Not Hate straight to the Cabinet Office. Another part of the Home Office is the UK Passport Office, which has since issued the passport to Hope Not Hate's reporter under the name that appears to be a temporary pseudonym. So public money is being given to Hope Not Hate, both directly and indirectly, so that they can smear their political opponents and the political opponents of what used to be the opposition party and is now the party of government. So not only does this fall outside the purview of a charitable purpose, going beyond the bounds of legality, one, it seems that Hope Not Hate enjoy privileged funding and access to politicians, which may be why they have skirted any comeuppance for their potential lawbreaking, but two, it's wholly immoral to have the state attack its political dissidents in this way, through an organised, well-funded network of reputation destruction, which in some instances has led to vigilante attacks against the targets of Hope Not Hate by Antifa cells and jihadists. So how does Hope Not Hate get its funding? The Free Speech Union are investigating this, having poached journalist David Rose from Unheard to now investigate how Hope Not Hate and the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, founded by Morgan McSweeney, and the Global Disinformation Index get funding, and how they are able to lobby governments for pro-censorship causes. But Charlotte Gill, the independent journalist on Substack, who used to write for The Telegraph and the like, has done a lot of investigation into this, as have I for Courage Media. Charlotte found that the Home Office was giving £114,380 to Hope Not Hate in government grants. There were also local government organisations that were giving Hope Not Hate money, and so Hope Not Hate have been the beneficiaries of not just privileged access, but hundreds of thousands in taxpayer cash funneled directly to them by the previous Conservative government, and now, who knows how much, by the sitting Labour government. Why and how are Hope Not Hate a charitable organisation when they're clearly partisan party political? Well, the Charities Act 2011, again, implemented by the former Conservative government, thank you, Michael Gove, define the purpose of a charity as, under Section 3, Clause H, the advancement of human rights, conflict resolution, or reconciliation, or the promotion of religious or racial harmony, or equality and diversity. So, if you are a DEI organisation, you get to be the beneficiary of charitable status by the government. You get more funding, and you get, in some cases, including in Hope Not Hate's, direct funding from the taxpayer, because the government has a statutory duty under the Equality Act 2010 to ensure that they are upholding the clause of non-discrimination and are committed to anti-racism, equality, and diversity. So if you can position yourself as a charity that is anti-racist, anti-fascist, and on the side of DEI, then as a matter of government policy, they have to give you money to say in their annual reports that they are upholding their end of the law. So until the Charities Act 2011, the Equalities Act 2010, and ancillary bits of legislation like the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, which ensures that civil servants cannot be hired and fired by ministers because the Civil Service Code is part of law, and so the civil service has to be neutral, and any intervention in the civil service by a minister is deemed politicising. Without repealing on those bits of legislation, Hope Not Hate remains an organ of the state. But they have also been the beneficiaries of bits of legislation passed by the Johnson government. This is a long essay on the history and activities of Hope Not Hate over at a Substack called The Restorationist. This was previously covered by my friend and former Lotus Eaters colleague Carl Benjamin on his channel. I'll link this down in the description. But they know, as I mentioned earlier, regarding undercover operations being farmed out to various anti-racist, anti-fascist undercover NGOs, they note that Boris Johnson's Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Act of 2021 allows intelligence officers and informants to murder, torture, bug, propagandize, and engage in injustice if it's in the interests of justice and the greater good. This means that intelligence agencies can basically deputize NGOs like Hope Not Hate, and they can do whatever they like, including deceiving members of the public with passports procured by deed polls, if it is in the interest of the greater good. The greater good defined as part of law that the government itself abides by as ensuring equality, diversity, anti-racism, community cohesion, and all of these other leftist buzzwords. So if Hope Not Hate do have connections to intelligence, which the opaqueness of the Home Office and direct funding from the Home Office and Harry Shukman's MI6 connections by his family seem to insinuate that they might, then they are insulated by bits of government legislation from any legal scrutiny, because whatever they do, in utilitarian fashion, even if it includes doxing or, heaven forbid, direct violence, could be excused away as being for the greater good. The greater good as defined by leftist legislation that the previous government entrenched, and even if it didn't believe in, it abided by. But now, the current sitting government, containing members of Hope Not Hate, of Searchlight Magazine, and people who are affiliated with it, they definitely believe in this legislation. And so they are going to give Hope Not Hate and its affiliates a very wide berth concerning whether or not they break the law. This article mentions the history of Hope Not Hate here, and it says that Jerry Gable, who was a young communist who volunteered for the Daily Worker newspaper, now the Morning Star, and later as a trade union community organizer, became disillusioned as a political candidate for the Communist Party of Great Britain when it appeared to turn against his own ethnic interests. That's how they editorialize it. Jerry Gable is Jewish. He became the intelligence officer for a group of thugs in London who were then denounced by their own communities for wanting to take revenge on the Nazis, and in 1964, both Gable and two accomplices were convicted of entry by artifice, burglarizing, the flat of historian David Irving, who has said some contentious things, of course, about Hitler and the Holocaust. They posed as General Post Office telephone engineers to steal documents to give it to Special Branch. The same year, Gable and a group of Labour MPs founded Searchlight, with himself as the research director. Searchlight is a anti-fascist magazine. One of Searchlight's journalists was eventually convicted of arson. So this seems to be a rat's nest of disreputable figures. By the 1970s, Gable was working for London Weekend Television as a researcher, releasing memos boasting of links to the intelligence services, and Searchlight was publishing claims that key establishment figures were part of a secret paramilitary neo-Nazi group called Column 88. The information purportedly came from a former Communist Party activist, Dave Roberts, who infiltrated the National Front and was later arrested for assault on a restaurant waiter and arson on Communist Party premises. Left-wing publications then became suspicious that the group was fabricated or exaggerated, and 20 years later, Searchlight published in their community handbook that it was in fact a state honey trap related to identifying unionist militants attached to the violence in Northern Ireland. Basically, Searchlight bought false information fed to them by the intelligence services. I wonder how they came by that particular piece of information. So, the roots of Hope Not Hate are deep in a former anti-fascist magazine founded by Labour MPs with intelligence connections. Gable himself seems like a deeply disreputable and unhinged figure. Restorationists write that he racked up the BBC several £100,000 in libel fees while working for Panorama because he claimed in their episode Maggie's Militant Tendency that members of the Tory party were secret Nazis. Private Eye then were forced to pay out for libel when they falsely published a member of the military police had tried to murder Gable. He seems like a deeply paranoid individual. During the 1990s, Gable then revealed the existence of a secret neo-Nazi paramilitary group for ITV's World in Action, named Combat 18. This time the information came from a BNP infiltrator, Tim Heppel, and another National Front extremist, Matthew Collins. Matthew Collins is a very interesting name to note, because Matthew Collins was a former self-described neo-Nazi, but is now a researcher at Hope Not Hate, who is a member of the Communist Party, according to his own Facebook page, and who in 2013, as GB News reported, said the following at a Hope Not Hate event with the Soviet Union's emblem behind him.
Comrades, brothers and sisters, hopenotHate.org.uk, you are our Red Army. Thank you very much.
Remember, the Red Army were the USSR's military force that laid siege to surrendering Germany and murdered and raped children and the elderly by the thousands. So to celebrate that, calling other people at Hope Not Hate event comrades with the emblem of the genocidal Soviet Union behind him means he supports a genocidal socialist regime, and so are Hope Not Hate really reputable sources on what is and isn't extreme? When they call people Nazis, are they being accurate? Or are they just creating a bogeyman to hide the fact that they support reprehensible politics, an ideology which has led to the murder of millions of people throughout the 20th century, and so are trying to give cover to their own evil extremist political activism? The term Hope Not Hate first came into being in 2004, affiliated with Searchlight, before Nick Lowles left the magazine and made Hope Not Hate its own entity. Searchlight Information Services became Hope Not Hate, a limited company, and the Searchlight Educational Trust was renamed to Hope Not Hate Charitable Trust. So Searchlight seems to have seamlessly transitioned, at least part of it, into Hope Not Hate, and the existing funding body for Searchlight, despite the disreputable activities of Jerry Gable, seem to have become the way for Hope Not Hate to fund its activism, which is deeply enmeshed with government departments and now the Labour Party. Hope Not Hate were paid by the Home Office, by the London Assembly, and employed by the Department for Communities and Local Government under the Tory party. That was Michael Gove's department. Perhaps these Spectator investigations are him making amends. I did raise this, by the way, during my debate with Michael Gove, and yet again the footage isn't out there, but if it ever does get released, you judge whether or not his answer is sufficient. You can read the rest of Restorationist's case against Hope Not Hate in your own time, but I want to focus on their present engagement with government. And this starts with the government's top lawyer, Lord Richard Hermer. The Attorney General, who, again, is the man who personally brought charges against Tommy Robinson for screening his documentary, and who worked round the clock to ensure that magistrates' courts convicted far-right racists, stirring up hate online and in person in the aftermath of the Southport protests, Richard Hermer used to work for Searchlight. This excellent article in the Daily Skeptic by Laurie Wastel found that Hermer is very open in an interview with House Magazine about his career in student politics as the chair of the Students' Union and a national executive member of the National Union of Students, and his work for the Union of Jewish Students, but it omits entirely his association with Searchlight. In reality, as the below Searchlight clip shows, he might never have achieved the National Union of Students role were it not for his being a Searchlight member and willingness to campaign on their behalf. As the Searchlight clipping says, quote, "The biggest pleasure for the Searchlight team so far this year was to speak at the largest of the fringe meetings at the National Union of Students Spring Conference in Blackpool. The meeting was held in support of Richard Hermer, a candidate for the union executive running on an anti-racist and anti-fascist ticket. Richard is also the editor of On Guard, the youth publication of the anti-fascist movement. He romped home in the election with the biggest single vote of any candidate. During the last month, Searchlight speakers were heard twice on the radio, and we helped research a major two-part investigation into the British National Party in Scotland, which appeared in the Sunday Mail." So they had a lot of influence over the British press at the time. The team spoke at meetings in Hove, Keele, Canterbury, Milton Keynes and Oxford, as well as several in the Greater London area, and played a major role in organising against the BNP rally at Thamesmead and in a surveillance of the League of St George Conference in London on the 25th of May. The editor and some of the team were invited to the launch of the book Neo-Fascism in Europe, to which we had contributed a chapter on Britain. The gathering at the Italian Institute in London was very well attended, and a lively question and answer session followed speeches by 3 leading academics. Searchlight's editor left the audience in no doubt about the nature of fascism in the 1990s and its dangers. So, Searchlight, and thereby Hope Not Hate, and thereby Lord Hermer, the sitting Attorney General in the Labour government, have connections to an international leftist network of, quote, anti-fascists, some of whose members have been prosecuted for violence, property destruction, and been sued for libel in the past. A lot of Hope Not Hate's tactics are starting to look like projection now, aren't they? Laurie Wastel continues, "No doubt understanding its association with Hermer raises eyebrows. Searchlight proceeds to downplay his involvement since leaving university. Later in his career, Richard also helped Searchlight with occasional legal advice and was a patron of Searchlight Research Associates, is all we learn. Though it can't help but add, we are proud to count him amongst our friends. Daily Skeptic has seen documents that show his involvement in Searchlight continued long after his student days, well into his career as a lawyer. So much so that in 1996, 3 years after being called to the bar, Hermer was being recommended to join the magazine's management committee. The man who put his name forward was Jerry Gable, Searchlight's long-serving editor who once stood for election for the Communist Party and in the 1980s produced research for a BBC Panorama documentary that falsely alleged 2 Conservative Party members were secret Nazis, after which the BBC lost a libel trial and had to pay damages. Again, projection by Hope Not Hate against The Spectator and John Power. Later, minutes show Lord Hermer missing a meeting in June 1999, so he was expected to attend, and attending one in November that year, alongside Nick Lowles, who was the co-editor and then editor of Searchlight between 1999 and 2011, and in 2004 founded Hope Not Hate. So Hope Not Hate continues to enjoy connections to the highest level of government, including Keir Starmer's chief advisor, Keir Starmer's best friend and Attorney General, Lord Hermer, a Labour baroness who until very recently sat on its advisory board, Ruth Smeeth, or now Ruth Anderson, and it has enjoyed funding from the Home Office. Perhaps it still enjoys funding from government departments. We have yet to find that out from the Free Speech Union. And it enjoys connections to high-profile MPs in the Labour government, who are still connected to Hope Not Hate and hosted a parliamentary launch event for its working group in Parliament in summer amidst the Southport protests, when Nick Lowles was spreading false information about them online, without any consequences. It is unclear when or whether Hermer's tenure on the management committee ended, Wastell writes, but suffice to say his post-university involvement with Searchlight clearly went well beyond occasional legal advice. He was still part of Searchlight's research associates as late as 2016. So, even if he doesn't have any formal affiliation with Hope Not Hate or Searchlight, the ideas are certainly being laundered into the highest echelons of government and are affecting Britain's legal system, and you wonder why we have two-tier justice in this country. Wastell writes that he came by these documents via Notes from the Borderland, a left-green parapolitical investigative magazine, very much in the Pabloist tradition of Keir Starmer's Marxist activism, as a student and as a lawyer, whose complaints about Searchlight are long-running and legion. In particular, it alleges a link with MI5, citing a 1977 memo showing Jerry Gable preparing reports on other journalists for London Weekend Television with the assistance of propaganda input by MI5, as reported by the New Statesman in 1980. While Wastell can't speak to its veracity, readers may be interested to read an extensive investigation it has carried out into the 1999 Soho nail bombing, which killed 3 and was an important justification for the 2000 Terrorism Act, and which it alleges Searchlight had information about which could have led to it being avoided. NFB's Blue Sky handle can be found linked in the article, and I will link the article down in the description. Yet again, it's clear that Hope Not Hate sits at the centre of a nexus of Antifa organisations, disreputable and even criminal actors in the past, like Jerry Gable and other members of Searchlight, and with connections to Parliament, the sitting government, intelligence services, and institutions like the Home Office. And so, without activity from the likes of our American friends, who hold the purse strings here, we, the British public, are subjected to this massive intelligence and gaslighting operation with no recourse through democratic politics. Because anytime someone engages in free speech, debate, political campaigning, they are smeared and sabotaged by Hope Not Hate with the backing of the state. As Wastell says here about Tommy Robinson's documentary Silenced, which resulted in him spending a long time in solitary confinement on a civil charge, it was Nick Lowles, through Hope Not Hate, who informed Lord Hermer's Attorney General's office that the film had been played at the protest. A contempt of court charge was then subsequently brought by Hermer himself. It was announced over X. This was personal for him. Searchlight is still operational, by the way, despite being decoupled, at least ostensibly, from Hope Not Hate. Wastell notes here that mentions of grooming gangs are rather few and far between on its website. But in the wake of the media coverage of the issue this year, a grim article appeared by a senior Searchlight researcher, Amir Mohammed, who I'm sure has no conflict of interest, titled, "I'll Tell You Who Most Despises So-Called Muslim Grooming Gangs, Honest-to-Goodness Muslims." Well, what's Hope Not Hate's record been on the grooming gangs? When Suella Braverman, as Home Secretary, set up a grooming gangs task force and said that it is a majority Pakistani Muslim male problem, Hope Not Hate joined forces with academic Ella Cockbain, who, despite finding in her own samples that 80% of the perpetrators were Pakistani Muslim men and she didn't know what to do about it, they joined forces to condemn Suella Braverman's remarks as far-right. Ella Cockbain said that Suella Braverman's rhetoric is a gift to the far-right and has just massively mainstreamed far-right talking points. Bear in mind that the most recent report commissioned by the Labour government, with Dame Louise Casey heading it up, had dismissed Cockbain's reporting on a 2020 Home Office report for The Guardian as wholly fictitious and actually dangerous, saying that actually white men are the majority perpetrators of child sexual abuse in the country because it omitted the specific type of predation that grooming gangs were committing and the per capita rates of offending in specific towns. But also, Nick Lowles reared his head, saying that, as Chief of Hope Not Hate, the Home Secretary's language stirs up hate. Quote, "Child sexual abuse has long been a trope used by the likes of far-right activist Tommy Robinson and the far-right in their Islamophobic narratives about the Muslim community. The Home Secretary singling out British Pakistani men when child sexual abuse is not confined to a specific ethnic group irresponsibly stirs up hate." Hope Not Hate also conducted the focus groups for the all-party parliamentary definition of Islamophobia published in 2019. And during this, they said the following about the grooming gangs. That the recourse to the notion of free speech and a supposed right to criticize Islam results in nothing more than another subtle form of anti-Muslim racism, whereby the criticism humiliates, marginalizes, and stigmatizes Muslims. So criticism of Islam and an appeal to free speech for the reason why you should be able to criticize Islam is actually just proof of your racism and Islamophobia. This was the definition, by the way, that was adopted by the Labour government when it was still the Labour opposition under Keir Starmer in 2019. One real-life example of this concerns the issue of grooming gangs in quotation marks, they write. Participants reported being told that Mohammed is a paedophile, for instance. He did marry a 6-year-old. This comment does not, in a strictly grammatical sense, have the victim themselves as the subject, but is rather an example of the criticism of Islam as it is actually articulated and experienced, yet clearly it is aimed at and can achieve harm to individual Muslims and is not rooted in any meaningful theological debate, but rather in a racist attempt to other Muslims in general, associating them with the crime our society sees most abhorrent of all. This strategy has been actively pursued by far-right groups, including the BNP and EDL, but has also been indulged, especially as our previous research has shown, in relation to grooming gangs by mainstream politicians of all our major parties. They are saying that conversations about the grooming gangs as a Muslim or Pakistani issue is Islamophobic, and trying to say that you are just talking about crimes committed against children, or that you have a free speech right to discuss anything you like, is itself further proof that you are a racist and Islamophobe because you're trying to hide your racism and Islamophobia. The worst child abuse scandal in the country was systematically covered up with the help of major political parties, of media institutions, of sitting MPs, members of the House of Lords, social workers, police officers, and Hope Not Hate helped build the climate of censorship that made speaking about the issue impossible. Elsewhere in the report, they say, quote, "We also found that age-old stereotypes and tropes about Islam, such as sexual profligacy and paedophilia, or Islam and violence, and their modern-day iteration in the, quote, Asian grooming gangs, in scare quotes, or scare quotes, Bin Laden, labels re-emerge in discourses and dispositions which heighten vulnerability of Muslims to hate crimes. Translation, if you talk about the grooming gangs in an honest way, you are causing violence against Muslims." This organisation has no moral legitimacy, but yet again continues to enjoy privileged access to MPs, the press, the Home Office, the Attorney General, the Prime Minister's top advisor, and perhaps the Prime Minister, as well as intelligence agencies. Emma Schubart, the criminally underfollowed researcher and data manager at the Adam Smith Institute, did the following thread on Hope Not Hate's history and Jerry Gable. Very trustworthy looking man. She covers here the Column 88 scandal, where yet again, since the 1970s, they were spreading fake news about a sophisticated neo-Nazi plot in Britain. They claimed Column 88 had 200 to 300 members. The story then exploded. But when independent papers reported on Column 88, they cited their source, a man helping Special Branch. Searchlight, supposedly also independent, did not. Searchlight peddled the Column 88 story for years, ratcheting up the threat and the severity. These reports made so much noise they prompted parliamentary questions in the House of Commons in 1976, where the Secretary of State for Defence dismissed Column 88 as small neo-Nazi drinking club. In 1993, Searchlight then admitted the Column 88 story was in fact fabricated. Much like the scaremongering about the imminent organised far right depicted in Hope Not Hate's documentary Undercover exposing the far right, much like the bogeyman that they have made Tommy Robinson out to be, with again the support of the security agencies, members of parliament, the media, and the sitting Attorney General and Prime Minister. Emma's research into the roots of Hope Not Hate and their impropriety then led to Jack Rankin, MP, launching an investigation into their charitable status. The investigation has not concluded yet, so we still have yet to see. But even if their charitable status is stripped, they still enjoy privileged access to members of parliament and the government. For example, as Guido Fawkes has reported here, Government Whip Anna Turley is both director and a member of its board of trustees. MP Sarah Owen is vice chairman of the group's parliamentary group, made up of exclusively Labour MPs. Another of the campaigning organisation's directors also happens to be a prominent Labour MP and TUC communications director, Antonia Bance. Chairman of its trustee board is also newly elected Labour MP Gurinder Singh Josan. Another member of its board is Kari Asim. He has an MBE, he's the Imam at Leeds Mosque, and he is a trustee of both British Future, Sundar Katwala's organisation, and of Hope Not Hate. And Kari Asim has some powerful friends. As you can see here, he was presenting a Muslim-Jewish accord, signed by many Jewish and Muslim leaders, to King Charles III at Buckingham Palace. As the Movement for Reform Judaism reports, Progressive Judaism co-leads Rabbi Josh Levy, CEO of the Movement for Reform Judaism, and Rabbi Charlie Baginski, CEO of Liberal Judaism, were among the 12 senior Muslim and Jewish denominational leaders who today signed a landmark agreement, the Drum-Lanrig Accord, which marks a defining moment in interfaith relations in the UK. Rooted in virtue and ethical principles, the Accord establishes a structured framework for sustained Muslim-Jewish collaboration. The faith leaders were then honoured to present a copy of the Accord to His Majesty King Charles III at Buckingham Palace. So, one of the directors of Hope Not Hate, a imam, is having an audience with the king to push conciliatory relations with Muslims and Jews. But yet again, this is an entirely foreign ideology and religion to Britain. The British people aren't represented here, and although it has no concern to native Brits, they get an audience with the king for their interfaith initiative. And as you can see, Kari Asim is sat at the table. Kari Asim was also interviewed by The Guardian on 7/7 to say British Muslims are really the victims of the backlash to Muslim terrorists and the repeated instances of Muslim terror. Think the Lee Rigby murders, the Bataclan massacre in France, the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing, the 2 London bridge attacks, the Westminster Bridge attack, the recent synagogue shooting on Yom Kippur, and on and on and on. But The Guardian thinks it's important to platform a trustee of Hope Not Hate, an imam at Leeds Mosque, to say British Muslims are actually the victims of true prejudice, of Islamophobia. Islamophobia, as defined by Hope Not Hate, as being having open and honest conversations about the composition of the grooming gangs. Kari Asim is also a curious individual to platform. Number one, because he is rumoured to be involved in the Labour government's current initiative to define Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred. But number two, because in 2022, he supported protests against the film Our Lady of Heaven, depicting Fatima. And this led to Cineworld feeling under threat of violence, the need to pull the film and close its venues down for the day. Kari Asim used to be an advisor on counter-extremism and a member of the Anti-Muslim Hatred Working Group for the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities under Michael Gove. And he was dismissed for supporting the protests because he said he was concerned the film risked fueling extremism and tension in communities that would undermine cohesion in British society. This man is still a trustee of Hope Not Hate. This man gets an audience with the king. This man is consulted by The Guardian as an expert on why British Muslims are actually the victim of prejudice and why the backlash to law-abiding Muslims, as the old Norm Macdonald joke goes, is worse than the terror attacks committed by Muslims. This is what Hope Not Hate thinks is appropriate, and this is the organisation that enjoys, again, privileged access to MPs, the sitting government, the Prime Minister's advisor, the Attorney General, the Home Office, and potential intelligence agencies. Lowles continues to enjoy puff pieces written about him in The Guardian, but also a long-standing friendship with a former Prime Minister, too. This article was written 2 months ago by Zoe Williams. You remember, the Guardian columnist who appeared to justify the Epping migrant hotel sex offences by Hadush Kabatu by saying, well, what did you expect? It's going to be difficult to fit into ordinary life if your hotel is encircled by protesters saying they don't want you here at all times. Number one, the crime came before the protests, Zoe. And number two, I don't think criminals commit crimes as a consequence of people pointing out that they commit crimes. I think they commit crimes because they're ontologically criminals and they deserve punishment rather than praise and empathy. But in this interview with Nick Lowles, again, glazing him about his anti-fascist work without ever trying to hold him to account for how he and his organisation operatives flout or skirt the law, it's noted that his new book, How to Defeat the Far Right, is Lowell's memoir cum manual, telling the story of how Hope Not Hate, the anti-fascist campaign group, came into existence in 2004. I'm sure it admits any intelligence connections or potential law breaking by previous members of Searchlight. I'm sure there's a big gaping hole in that story. A Jerry Gable-shaped gaping hole. There is no other organisation like it in its range of actions and independence of spirit. On that we agree, though perhaps not in independence. It does a lot of data, polling and analysis, but also a lot of community organising. It infiltrates fascist spaces online and off to subvert their plans, and it organises counter-protests. It is connected to institutional politics, Williams admits, though its influence waxes and wanes. Lowell's is a good friend of Gordon Brown's, but doesn't feel especially heeded by the current government, despite being invited to Downing Street and having a parliamentary working group and having Lord Hermer having worked for Searchlight with Lowell's, and Lowell's leaking to Hermer things about Tommy Robinson that then get him imprisoned. I think this is just lying here. In this paragraph, she notes that there are victories from Hope Not Hate. Embarking in Dagenham, Hope Not Hate campaigned to defeat the BNP after it did so well in the 2006 local elections that, had it stood more candidates, it would have been the first council in Britain controlled by an openly racist party. Possibly less well known is Hope Not Hate's foiling of a plot to murder the MP Rosie Cooper back in 2017. Jack Renshaw, a member of the banned far-right organisation National Action, planned to kill Cooper with a gladius machete that he'd already bought, as well as take hostages, lure in a detective, preferably female, and kill her as well. Another member of Renshaw's group was secretly passing all this information to Hope Not Hate, which enabled his arrest. And I think this was the material used in Stephen Graham of Adolescence fame's dramatisation of that infiltration effort, where he played Matthew Collins, the aforementioned communist. It's conspicuous then that Lowell's has a friendship with Gordon Brown, given Baroness Ruth Anderson, formerly Ruth Smeeth, of Stoke-on-Trent, was on Hope Not Hate's board until very recently. If you don't know who Ruth Smeeth or Ruth Anderson is, she was a British Labour Party politician who was a Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent North from 2015 until 2019. She was then awarded a peerage in the House of Lords in 2022. She used to work for the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre and then for Nestlé before becoming more actively involved in the Labour Party. She stood as a candidate in 2010 but was not elected under Gordon Brown. She was then named as an intelligence source to strictly protect by the US Embassy in London in a 2009 diplomatic cable published online in 2011. This was leaked as part of WikiLeaks and published by The Telegraph. What had happened is a communique was sent from the US Embassy on the 24th of April 2009 that reported that Gordon Brown had planned to go to the country and call a general election after Labour had risen in the opinion polls after the G20 summit in London. The plan was called off after it emerged that Damien McBride had sent emails to Labour aides containing unfounded allegations about the personal lives of senior Conservatives, and McBride was forced to resign. The intelligence, as written by Christopher Hope, about a surprise election came allegedly from an unlikely source, Ruth Smeeth, the Labour candidate for Burton at the last election. American diplomats in London clearly took Miss Smeeth seriously, as her name was followed by a recommendation to strictly protect her identity. The cable said, perhaps most damaging of all, however, Smeargate effectively ended what may have been Brown's call to a general election this spring, based on the rise in the polls he received following his solid performance at the G20. Ruth Smeeth, brackets strictly protect, told us April 20th that Brown had intended to announce the elections on May 12th and hold them after a very short matter of weeks campaign season. How did Ruth Smeeth have connections with American intelligence as a parliamentary candidate who wasn't even elected with no name recognition? Was it something to do with the fact that she was then involved in Hope Not Hate? That Nick Lowell seems to have had a close friendship with Gordon Brown? How was this fed back? Was this done using backroom channels that Hope Not Hate has with intelligence services? Again, all of these questions have been raised, but it does point to Hope Not Hate having very high-powered connections in the House of Lords, in the sitting government, in the House of Parliament, in potentially the intelligence services, but certainly the Home Office and, of course, the press, who constantly give them puff pieces and never examine their impropriety, whether it be financial, whether it be legal, or at the very least, their deceptive investigative tactics, and their attempt to make people targets for left-wing organizations, or, in the case of Douglas Murray's article, jihadists. It's also notable that Ruth Smeeth was elected the parliamentary chair of the Jewish Labour movement in April 2019 and served until she lost the contest as an MP in December that same year, when Boris Johnson beat Jeremy Corbyn. From 2010 to 2015, she was deputy director of Hope Not Hate. She has also been employed by the Community Security Trust and worked for the Board of Deputies of British Jews, so she is intimately involved in Jewish advocacy movements. She seems to have intelligence connections, and she was still on the board of Hope Not Hate while a baroness until last year. Smeeth is also married to Michael Smeeth, who is the UK chair of the British American Project. So if our American allies over in Washington are trying to crack down on the international Antifa network, there are some American interests at play here too that you may want to look into. Now, Smeeth had to be defended by a security detail during the height of anti-Semitism allegations in the Labour Party because she had received credible threats, which is abhorrent and nobody supports. She's not the only Jewish Labour MP to have faced this. Currently, MP Damien Egan, who has been involved in Labour politics for well over a decade, was threatened many years ago and had to get security detail because his husband is born Israeli and served in the IDF. Damien Egan is a conspicuous figure in the history of Hope Not Hate because at the height of Hope Not Hate's campaign to unseat the BNP from barking in Dagenham and counteract the BNP running in council by-elections across London, Damien Egan was running for the council by-election in Lewisham, and Hope Not Hate were trying to pressure Damien Egan to be more outspoken against the BNP. As this Guardian article says, it all highlights the bigger question of the best way to beat Nick Griffin's nasties. I can't see John Crudas and Hope Not Hate adopting Lewisham Labour's approach. Does Labour in London have a unified line on the issue? Basically accusing Egan and Labour in London for not being sufficiently aligned enough with Hope Not Hate against the BNP at the time. Well, Damien Egan is now the MP for Bristol North East and is now spearheading an initiative to form a new all-party parliamentary group on countering extremism. Egan told The Times, "It's alarming that the government has no clear strategy to address the fast-evolving threat of extremism." We'll get onto the definition of extremism shortly. There are 8 Labour MPs and 7 Labour peers in the new cross-party group, so it's heavily weighted towards the current government and the Labour Party. They launched with a report called Time to Act, and it concluded, while recognising the accelerating threat of extremism, the UK has not sufficiently addressed this challenge. The UK is flying blind, where it has not operationalised its definition of extremism, nor has the metrics to assess the spread and scale of the threat we face. The definition of extremism they're using was concocted by Michael Gove in March of 2024, before the election, where he got up at the dispatch box and announced the definition by saying, Britain is a multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy, and diversity is our strength. This definition was invented by Dame Sarah Khan, who was the government's so-called Independent Counter-Extremism Commissioner from 2018 to 2021, and then continued to work for the Home Office alongside Michael Gove on counter-extremism. She produced a number of briefing papers, including a briefing paper that threatened about the risk of extremism from the far right and certain sects of Islam, though Prevent, under that guidance, was insistent that Islamism has nothing to do with Islam, and it completely omitted the fact that Black Lives Matter and far-left groups were agitating for violence and separatism on Britain's streets. So, a gaping hole in her analysis that conveniently fits the exact ideology of the likes of Hope Not Hate. Dame Sarah Khan backed this paper. She is backing this new all-party parliamentary group on countering extremism, meaning that Dame Sarah Khan's ideas will now be filtering through the all-party parliamentary group and informing the sitting government's counter-extremism strategy. How has Dame Sarah Khan been defining extremism and identifying extremists recently? Well, in this piece that I wrote for Courage Media last year, Dame Sarah Khan released a report in December of 2024 alleging that Britain faces a chronic risk of democratic decline due to the spread of extremist narratives and conspiracies, growing societal threats and declining social cohesion. The allegation sounds serious, until you realise that Hope Not Hate commissioned the research. They did the polling, they ensured that the sources were aligned with their worldview. So if Dame Sarah Khan doesn't think communist activist group Hope Not Hate, which doxes members of the public and uses, if not illegal, definitely immoral, duplicitous strategies to ensnare subjects of their investigations. If she doesn't think they're extremist, then we can't trust her definition on extremism at all. It's also notable that Khan frequently cites the Centre for Countering Digital Hate in her report, which, again, was founded by Morgan McSweeney, seemingly a friend of Nick Lowell's, who invited Lowell's to Downing Street to brief the Prime Minister on extremism after they won the election. It's conspicuous then that while Khan was working at the Home Office, she oversaw all of those grants being given to Hope Not Hate. £50,000 and £141,380 between 2019 and 2020 to brief multiple departments on emerging trends in UK hate. Hope Not Hate also received £240,000, £275,000 and £60,000 from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, so that's £585,000 over 8 years. The Paul Hamlyn Foundation themselves received £1.36 million in government grants between 2020 and 2024. So more government money is being funneled via other organisations to Hope Not Hate, to establish a UK network of young migrant leaders and a network of leaders and organisations within towns who will respond to local needs and pressure points to share learning to enable rapid response to provocative elements. Basically, rapid response protesting foot soldiers to create the impression that there is an outpouring of outrage against the far right anytime there is a terror attack or a protest against immigration. You know, the exact kind of protests that Nick Lowell's admitted sprung up after the Southport riots in response to the hoax of hundreds of far-right rioters taking to the streets. The same left-wing activist organisations that ended up ubiquitously on the front cover of newspapers the following day with similar headlines, despite the newspapers having different ideological slants, presenting them as an organic movement pushing back against the far right. These tactics, controlling the front cover of newspapers, were the exact tactics that Dame Sarah Khan employed while she was working for the Home Office and while her sister was the head of Raiku. Sarah Khan's charity Inspire spearheaded an initiative called #MakingAStand, which the then Home Secretary and later Prime Minister Theresa May came to the launch of, and showcased an image produced by Breakthrough Media, a media entity that has links to Bell Pottinger and the Home Office, of a woman in the Union Jack hijab. The head of Raiku, by the way, Richard Chalk, was running covert operations for Bell Pottinger in Iraq during the Iraq War, and then returned and was immediately made both the head of Raiku and the chief of staff to then Conservative Party chair, Baroness Saida Vorsi, who constantly accuses her own party of Islamophobia. That image, that Raiku called our product in emails that were procured from Freedom of Information Access requests, ended up on the front page of The Sun on October the 8th, 2014, after British aid worker Alan Henning was beheaded on video by ISIS to show the true face of British Islam. Basically, to stop the public from blaming Islam for the beheading of a British national. And Dame Sarah Khan is the person that is going to be shaping this brand new counter-extremism all-party parliamentary group, thereby yet again shaping the government's response to what is and isn't considered extremist. So Hope Not Hate's ideas and their activism will be laundered through government again, omitting the fact that the left are violent and myopically focusing on the far right at the expense of tackling and preventing lethal Islamic terror. If you look at Dame Sarah Khan and her sister's record at the Home Office, at Prevent, in stopping extremism, they haven't done very well, yet they seem to being employed by the government. There's also another problem with allowing Dame Sarah Khan and Hope Not Hate to shape what is defined as far right. And that is the double standard which lots of people are uncomfortable talking about, but which, because of Lord Hermer and Jerry Gable and Ruth Smeeth, is present in this conversation. And that is anti-Semitism in Israel. Because Damien Egan wrote the following article justifying why this all-party parliamentary group on counter-extremism was needed, and he mentioned left-wing as well as right-wing and religious extremism in here, so he might be trying to be even-handed. However, his other parliamentary roles do call into question his ability to be impartial here. So if you look at his APPG officer roles page on the UK Parliament website, he is listed as the chair and registered contact of the Counter-Extremism APPG. He's also the co-chair of the Israel APPG. Now, given his husband is Israeli, he himself is converted to Judaism in the Bromley Synagogue, and his husband is a former IDF soldier, and he has faced what were deemed to be credible threats on the grounds of anti-Semitism for his marriage and his faith, well, he's probably a Zionist. And so it's frustrating to see the same MPs, the same lords like Ruth Smeeth, the same activists like Nick Lowles, ardently defend Zionism and the right for Israel to be a homeland for the Jewish ethnic people, but insist that anyone who speaks in such terms about England is a far-right racist. Tommy Robinson doesn't even speak in those terms. He is far more an ardent crusader for preserving the ethnic integrity of Israel than he is in England. This isn't an insult to Robinson, but he is a civic nationalist. And yet he is the arch bogeyman for Hope Not Hate. So why does Hope Not Hate and its MPs that liaise with it and identify with its definitions, its baronesses, its attorney general, why do they ardently protect the right for Israel to protect the Jewish ethnic people, but then demand Britain be multi-ethnic, multicultural, liberal, and accuse anyone saying there might be problems with that settlement, including racial crimes committed by migrants? Why do they call them far-right and racist and try to put a target on their back and ruin their reputation? Put them at risk of violence, even, by including them in their state of hate report. It's a double standard that just can't be sustained. And so this isn't a point about legality or funding or the immorality of their tactics. It's just to say that this is the reason why opposition to Hope Not Hate has grown. It's not just that you've attacked and smeared so many people that didn't deserve it, but it's that, quite clearly, your ideologies are bunk. You can't have blood and soil nationalism for Israel and then suicidal liberal multiculturalism for England upon pain of complete reputation destruction if you don't try and uphold that double standard. We're just not going to abide by it, I'm afraid. There's also reasons to be worried that the government is still taking Hope Not Hate's lead on things. Rupert Lowe, MP, one of the only parliamentarians actually doing any work, has inquired how many staff the Government Communication Services has. It's a unit that spies on social media posts by members of the public and MPs. 6,150 members of staff, and the total budget is not held centrally in the Cabinet Office. This means they probably have millions of pounds and man-hours at their disposal to counter anti-immigrant social media posts and spy on members of the public. This was first reported by The Telegraph. It has been brought to the attention of the US State Department, but the Cabinet Office now spends its days monitoring social media posts and counteracting narratives that target vulnerable audiences. As The Telegraph reports on the case studies of what the Cabinet Office unit spends its time doing, using anonymised case studies, Local Government Association guidance advises officials on how to counter information about the arrival of asylum seekers settling in hotels and vacant military bases and the sudden closure of the town's hotel to accommodate asylum seekers. Basically, it spends its time gaslighting the public to not get angry about the fact that foreign criminals are being housed at your expense in houses of multiple occupancy and hotels that should be otherwise occupied by holidaymakers or British families. And about the fact that you're paying for the privilege of being demographically replaced by men who disproportionately commit acts of violent and sexual crime, including against children. And one of the examples that they stepped in on were the summer hotel protests, which were sparked, yet again, by Hadush Kabatu trying to sexually proposition a 14-year-old schoolgirl 8 days after breaking into the country, and parents realising he was being housed at the Bell Hotel in Epping, right near a school, and then the Home Office paying lawyers to try to fight to keep the hotel full of foreign criminals against the wishes of locals and the council, and therefore winning a legal case against our own people to keep housing those foreign criminals in the hotel near the school. The scale of treachery is unbelievable, and when you complain about it online, you're then monitored by the Cabinet Office. Why am I mentioning this? Well, because, in Dame Sarah Khan's report, one of her recommendations was to establish a new centralised directorate inside the Cabinet Office to deliver wholesale change in how Whitehall addresses the challenge of preventing democratic decline, strengthening social cohesion, and building democratic and societal resilience and countering extremism and other related threats. These include watching Andrew Tate clips. I'm not making that up. Other narratives that Sarah Khan thinks are extremist, quote, alongside the promotion of large swap theory, I have to use a euphemism there for YouTube, contemporary far-right narratives on asylum seekers allude to them as Muslim invaders, with small boat crossings being characterized as an invasion of fighting-age men. So they think that you describing foreign criminals breaking into your country, lured there by people smuggling gangs using footage of young British girls, drunk and in states of undress by Muslim standards, in their marketing materials, they think that you describing that as an invasion of fighting age men is racist and should be countered by the Cabinet Office. I wonder why this entity now has so much funding and so many staff. Hope Not Hate seems to have intelligence connections in America. This is a piece by my friend Charles Cornish Dale, formerly Raw Egg Nationalist, until he was doxxed by Hope Not Hate. And he tells a story of how he arrived at a farm shop, and the owner of the shop then placed a folded piece of paper, which was a printed email from an American journalist, Catherine Long, from Business Insider, asking if this farm shop owner could act as a source identifying Charles as Raw Egg Nationalist. Charles describes this as a parallel construction. This is something that journalists do when they are given information by an intelligence agency or a shady contact that they would like to hide. So they build a plausible narrative with different steps as to how they acquired the information that they can fall back on when pressed instead. He notes that Catherine Long, according to her LinkedIn profile, is an Ivy League graduate. She had a 7-month internship at the State Department. She worked for USAID, posting in Tajikistan. She was a specialist in Central Asian languages, fluent in Farsi and Tajik. Basically a prime candidate for being a contact for intelligence agencies within the press. And then he mentions, of course, that Hope Not Hate don't just receive funding from the Home Office, but there have been long-standing allegations of their ties to intelligence services, which in this video and throughout the reporting I've cited, we've established have stretched back all the way to Jerry Gable and Searchlight. So it seems that Hope Not Hate do have powerful connections, not just to MPs and the press and the sitting Attorney General and a Labour Baroness, and even able to have their trustees gain an audience with the King, but also that they have links to the intelligence services, be it MI6, MI5, the Home Office, the Met Police, and that they seem to be privy to information about private individuals that otherwise they wouldn't be able to obtain if not for intelligence connections. So this is why it's very important, I think, for this to be escalated to the attention of the American State Department and any other relevant agency in Washington. Because Hope Not Hate have been identified by a Swedish government report as part of the global Antifa doxing and information exchange nexus that gets people attacked. As they report here, Hope Not Hate tweeted out the private location of a conference being run by Generation Identity, which was then read and republished by the Anti-Fascist Network account. Not long after the release of the address, Antifa arrived at the location and engaged in violence, with one of their number being arrested by the police. So they seem to be part of the pipeline which feeds the identities and locations of individuals that they have political disagreements with to vigilante far-left activist networks who then show up and cause trouble and are apprehended by the police or attack the people that Hope Not Hate has taken a dislike to. The Swedish Defence Research Agency report listed them for infiltration and research of political opponents alongside far-left extremist Antifa groups who have committed violence in Sweden. So it's clear that, again, Hope Not Hate sits at the nexus of government and NGOs and politicians and media, but also an international Antifa operation that coordinate with one another to share information and target fascists. Given that the likes of Charlie Kirk was also called a fascist, that Donald Trump was called a fascist, and now Charlie Kirk is dead, and firefighter and father, Corey Comparator, was killed as collateral damage in an attempt on Trump's life for those very reasons, it's pretty worrisome that such an influential, well-funded, well-connected organization can just smear people as the villains of the 20th century as they please, with protection from allies in government and funding from the taxpayer. So I think the US needs to step in here and say something about the fact that Hope Not Hate are threatening the integrity of free speech and politics in my country, that they are targeting private individuals like me, and putting them at risk of violence, because our own government isn't going to do anything. There are too many nested interests here. And so I hope that if anyone's listening, they've been taking notes. Hope Not Hate has attracted a lot of attention in the last year, and it's because they seem not to be held to account when there are question marks over whether or not they've broken the law. They have been the recipients of taxpayer funding. They enjoy privileged relationships with past prime ministers, sitting Labour baronesses, the sitting Attorney General, and MPs who launder their ideas through ostensibly neutral all-party parliamentary groups. They are a nefarious organisation that are dedicated to gatekeeping politics to the parameters that have proved disastrous for our country, including keeping the Pakistani grooming gang scandal quiet for fear of allegations of racism levelled by the likes of Hope Not Hate, and all of the other atrocities that have resulted from mass migration, which now the American State Department recognises as a grievous human rights violation. You shouldn't be able to threaten and intimidate people and put their lives at risk like this, especially when you have communists in your midst. I find that to be reprehensible. I have never advocated for a genocidal form of socialism as my preferred politics, and so I do not take you as morally legitimate actors. Neither do most of the public, considering you have smeared people beyond recognition who are just reasonable people who are just concerned about the state of their country. And so this is why I have called for this to be escalated to our American allies. Nobody likes this organisation. They act in bad faith, they skirt the law, and they have powerful friends protecting them. And so the only thing which is going to protect democracy and free speech and members of the British public engaging in perfectly lawful political activity is for you to step in and make it clear that these guys just can't operate anymore.